I'd like to begin this evening by asking you to visualize a flock of seabirds whirling above the ocean. Below the surface is a shoal of small fish, which are themselves circling a submerged seamount. As these circles turn independently, there are a series of small, violent collisions between birds, fish, and sea. Some bring gleaming treasures to our sightline, bright, small things that we can just glimpse in the right light. Now, let us imagine that these are not collisions of seabirds, prey, and water, but of other closely linked circles, of Arctic explorers, their families, and Indigenous intermediaries. The bright, gleaming things are records of these impacts: a poem, a map, a doll, a pair of moccasins. They are all kept in places far from where they are made, and each is a record of a moment in which one person asked another, "How can I trust you?" The seamount around which they are gathered are the archives of the family of Sir John Franklin, the Arctic explorer and one-time lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land, who vanished in 1845 on an expedition to chart the Northwest Passage. My book, Arctic Circles and Imperial Knowledge, maps some of these collisions and their wider ripples. In doing so, it traces the ways in which information, including rumor, supposition, and untruth, traveled across these intimate Arctic circles that formed out of the practices of polar exploration in the early 19th century. Now, the person who coined the term Arctic circles in 1827, Sir John Simpkinson, was referring to the circles of scientific sociability in London, in which explorers and their families came together with scientists, humanitarians, authors, and artists. I mean that, and something rather different. I mean those wide and heterogeneous groups of women, men, and children, friends, kin, and enemies, who came together, willingly and unwillingly, around experiences of polar exploration. They included explorers and their families, but also whalers, traders, activists, guides, and translators, many of whom had broken childhoods. They were anchored in time and place. They were also mobile and durable circles, reappearing in new and surprising contexts, sometimes on the other end of the earth. Like flocks of shearwaters and shoals of fish, they were part of broader webs and networks, both within and outside the British Empire. These included humanitarian and scientific networks, as well as Indigenous networks and pathways. All were instrumental in the making of imperial knowledge. Attending to how they did so, how they came together and broke apart, can help us to, as Alessandro Antonelli has put it, restory practices of exploration by braiding together the urgent need for truth-telling in the present with contests over credibility in the past. Now, this is a tall order, but we can anchor what Adele Perry has called these wide and wandering histories by attending to these moments of collision, in which the archives of the Franklin family are extraordinarily rich. Now, these materials are not without their challenges. They are not only spread across 3 continents, but have also been curated and redacted by the women of the Franklin family, one of whom famously exhorted the archivist at the Scott Polar Research Institute to, quote, "take out whatever is of polar interest and burn the rest." Moreover, this archival material has always existed in tension with the absence of material from the missing Franklin expedition itself. As Adriana Krakianer-Krashian has argued, the silence surrounding the Franklin expedition has its own generative force, animated by the desire to locate papers that might finally narrate what actually happened to the expedition. That perceived silence has always existed in tension with Indigenous testimony exchanged across tracks and trails that stretched between Siberia and Greenland in the mid-19th century. I am also then interested in collisions between different kinds of archives, state archives, family collections, oral histories, and material culture, all of which have been granted different kinds of authority. Now, in this sense, we are at a perfect historiographical moment to re-engage with the Franklin material from multidisciplinary angles, and that is in no small part because of the work of so many of you who have joined us tonight. This includes scholarship on imperial lives and biographies, which have taken the archives assembled to write biographies of great men and used them instead to shed light on the rich entanglements of families, gender, race, and class with imperial knowledge, colonial governance, and commerce. It includes your scholarship on how exploration narratives were produced, on the constellations of interests involved both in that process and in the making of expeditions themselves and the labor that goes into them, and on the contests of credibility and authority that underlay each step. It also includes important work on go-betweens, intermediaries, guides, and translators, which has helped us to think through the challenges of finding these people in archival collections and what it means when we do. So I would like to not only braid these strands of scholarship together, but also add to them the work of Indigenous scholars that attends to obligations and relationships, both human and non-human, that were made and broken as people faced empire, to use Kate Filligar's term. Doing so, I hope, will help us to continue to tell richer, more complex, and open-ended histories of exploration. So this evening is an experiment in restorying the first land Arctic expedition of 1819-22 by tracing the Arctic circles that emerged from it. First, we'll look at some of the intimacies and obligations that developed between expedition members and the Yellowknives Dina around Great Slave Lake, and then examine how they impacted familial and social circles in Britain after the expedition's return and far beyond. Now, I expect that much of this will be familiar to you, but I urge you to allow yourselves to glimpse it in a new light as we attend to the collisions between information and intimacy and the ripples that emerged from them. Now, discussions of John Franklin's career often begin with the renewed British search for the Northwest Passage in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, and then proceed to the end of his first land Arctic expedition in 1821, when he became known as the man who ate his boots. Since the boots that he ate were made of caribou skin with moose hide soles, I suggest that instead we should start with the caribou. Caribou are essential to survival in the circumpolar north. Inuit and Dini seamstresses have long made caribou skins into living works of art and essential tools of survival. Caribou meat is a vital food source, particularly when it is dried and portable. Caribou are also highly sensitive to human behavior, and many Arctic peoples believe that they withdraw in response to acts of selfishness and disrespect. It is that relationship between people and caribou that lies behind the politics of truth and the obligations and intimacies that it gave rise to on the first land Arctic expedition of 1819-22. Now, in the first quarter of the 19th century, people, animals, and territories around Great Slave Lake were shifting in response to unstable climate conditions at the end of the Little Ice Age. Winters were exceptionally severe and summers short and cold, and caribou and other animals changed their migration patterns. Starvation is frequent. At the same time, the British fur trade advanced further north, as violence escalated between both Yellowknives and Dogribs Dina on the shores of Great Slave Lake, on the one hand, and between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, both of which were rival fur companies, on the other. Now, combined with epidemic disease, the area around Great Slave Lake became what anthropologists have called a shatter zone. In this context, new leaders emerged, one of whom was the Yellowknives Dina leader, Kecho. He is remembered in Dogrib oral tradition as the embodiment of terror, and was also renowned for his charisma and his oratory. His relationship with British traders depended in large part on supplying them with caribou meat, both those on the Northwest Company stations and the Hudson's Bay Company stations, all which were badly overstretched at the very end of their supply lines at Great Slave Lake. According to both British and Dini sources, he was an ambitious man, with his sights set not only on controlling trade around Great Slave Lake, but as far as the Inuit territory at the mouth of the Coppermine River, territory that Yellowknives Dene knew poorly because of generations of Inuit and Dini hostility. Establishing peaceful commerce along the Coppermine was also one of the aims of the first Land Arctic expedition, which was sent to the Barren Grounds by the Colonial Office in 1819, the Colonial Office and the Admiralty, under the command of Lieutenant John Franklin. His instructions ordered him to, among other things, descend the Coppermine River and chart the Arctic coast, to correct the charts of his predecessor Samuel Hearne, and to establish peace between Dini and Inuit. The expedition included the surgeon naturalist Dr. John Richardson, the midshipmen George Beck and Robert Hood, the sailor John Hepburn, the Inuk translator Augustine Tatanoak from Fort Churchill, and his companion Junius or Huturak, the trader Willard Wenzel, and a corps of Athabasca men, elite voyageurs who were experienced in subarctic travel and in starvation. In addition, the expedition required skilled hunters, seamstresses, and a steady supply of food from Yellowknives Dene. And this was no small commitment in the years of 1819 to 21, in which hunger and disease afflicted Indigenous communities, rival fur companies entered open war, and lines of supply were badly overextended. As a result, the Land Arctic expedition found themselves entangled in webs of obligation that they did not fully understand, and in which their trustworthiness was always in question. These developing relationships were bound up with the exchange of information. In 1820, Acacho agreed to supply Franklin with meat, hunters, and families in return for access to the expedition's maps, translators, and especially the interpreter Augustine Tatanoak. This is an example of one of the maps that Franklin describes giving to Acacho at their first meeting in 1820. Now, Augustine, who's pictured in the upper right-hand corner, was an Inuk from Rankin Inlet who was literate, spoke at least 3 languages, was widely traveled, and was actively building his own webs of cross-cultural connections, both with Inuit, with Orkneymen, with other employees at the Hudson's Bay Company, with Cree, with Chippewan. In this, he was a truly remarkable person who was the first of many Inuit from Fort Churchill who would do so. Both Acacho and Franklin saw him as a human passport into Inuit territory, while he himself was keenly aware of his precarious status as an outsider and was constantly on his guard to be as agreeable and informative as possible. And we can talk about him much further in the questions if you like. Acacho also took steps to link his own family to the expedition. Among the Yellowknife families who went to the newly built Fort Enterprise in 1820 were Acacho's brother Keskara, who's pictured in the center, his wife, and their daughter, who was known to the expedition as Greenstockings, and she's pictured in on the far left. Over the winter of 1820 to 21, Greenstockings formed a partnership, willingly or unwillingly, with Robert Hood, the midshipman, which has long been seen as the principal source of tension in the expedition, particularly between Hood and the other midshipman, George Beck. Now, that may be so. It's laden with all kinds of accretion of meaning, which we can also talk about. But it's also important to remember that this was one of many fur trade intimacies in the 1820s, in which young women's labor, knowledge, and bodies were used to establish enduring partnerships between their kin and newcomers, to provide conduits of information about outsiders to their relatives, and to bind them together in circles of obligation. She, her mother, and grandmother were vital to the expedition, making snowshoes, mending skin clothing, and providing ethnographic information. Franklin and Acacho's agreement required Franklin to support these families out of his own provisions, but Franklin prioritized stockpiling provisions for his summer's journey to the coast and fulfilling his instructions from the Admiralty and the Colonial Office. And as a result, Over the difficult winter of 1820 to 21, he sent most of the families back to Acacho to look after, with the exception of Greenstockings and her parents. Now, certainly, Franklin's behavior towards Yellowknife hunters and families over the winter of 1820 violated the obligations he had made to provide for them, and questions over his trustworthiness allowed Acacho to demand payment and compensation in information. In December, Franklin began passing bad bills, paying Yellowknife hunters for caribou meat with bills drawn on a trading post which he knew had no goods and no ammunition to spare. Acacho responded by asserting sovereignty over the expedition's data. For example, in February of 1821, he arrived at the fort in state when it was so cold that the ink was freezing in the inkwell close to the fire, and required each map, each image, and each letter, including the image shown here, that Franklin intended to send to the colonial office by the next dispatch, to be spread in front of him and explained in detail by the translator of his choice before he consented to give Franklin any more provisions. It was only after he inspected the material that he chose to ignore, quote, the idle rumors that had been floating about the barren grounds, that the expedition was broke, and that Franklin intended to, quote, deceive the Indians by turning them off unrewarded, and we found that they could no longer be useful. When the expedition was preparing to depart in May, with supplies perilously low, Acacho again refused to supply them with food until he was assured that he would be paid, arguing that the British king, quote, must see from the drawings and descriptions of ourselves and our country, which you have sent, that we are in a pitiable condition. And I think it's notable because I've always been struck by these confrontations between Acacho and Franklin in his journals. And it's notable because you can see Acacho actively making and curating his own image and how it will be transmitted to this global audience. How his reported speech is translated, and he approves that translation before it's sent off. And you can also see him gesturing to this oratorical device that Mary Black Rogers has discussed, which is the varieties of starving in the subarctic fur trade. And effectively, that is drawing attention to one's pitiable condition in order to remind others of their obligations. In the summer of 1821, the party of naval officers, voyageurs, and Yellowknife hunters and families descended the Coppermine River into Inuit territory. When they reached the coast, Acacho told Franklin that if he did not return now, he would miss the caribou migration, and they'd be likely to starve. Bound to fulfill his instructions, Franklin refused, and Acacho, Willard Wentzel, and the hunters returned to Acacho's lodge with the expedition's letters and papers. Franklin's party continued along the coast in birch bark canoes until the voyageurs forced them to stop and to return by a new and untested route bearing by the compass for Fort Enterprise. As predicted, they missed the caribou migration and were forced to scavenge. Now, oddly, it was the most experienced men who began to die from exhaustion and starvation, a fact that would fuel rumors for years. The party split into three groups, one led by Back, one by Franklin, and another by Richardson. While Back and Augustine sought help from Acacho, Franklin headed for Fort Enterprise, and Richardson waited at a tent with the sailor John Hepburn and the ailing Robert Hood, who could not digest the lichen that they were surviving on. Finding Fort Enterprise unprovisioned, Franklin wrote a despairing letter to Back complaining of the miserable, wretched treachery of the Indians. Richardson, Hepburn, and Hood, meanwhile, were kept alive by the Mohawk voyageur Michel Terre Haute, who, according to Richardson, fed them the body of one of their companions before killing Hood. In retaliation, according to Richardson's account, he killed Michel, and he and Hepburn proceeded to Fort Enterprise, where they found Franklin and his party barely alive. As Hepburn later recalled, quote, inarticulate sounds issuing from the nose like grunts were their only means of conversation. In the 8 days that they starved together at Fort Enterprise, Franklin, Richardson, and Hepburn formed a fellowship of suffering that endured for decades. They structured their days around scavenging caribou hides and reading religious tracts, and later Franklin would write that, quote, I never experienced such positive happiness from the comforts of religion as in the moments of greatest distress. For the rest of their lives, Franklin, Richardson, and Hepburn would remind each other of Fort Enterprise at times of trouble, sorrow, and woe, on the death of a spouse, a child, a sibling, or when about to undertake a perilous journey. Richardson named his first two sons John Franklin and Henry Hepburn Richardson, and when they died, Franklin reminded him of the debts of Port Enterprise. Franklin took Hepburn with him to Tasmania, installed him in command of the boys' prison at Point Pure on the basis of his devotion and his religious feeling. And there are many other episodes of this, of recalling Fort Enterprise. Yellowknife hunters rescued the party at Fort Enterprise in early November of 1821, and Richardson and Hepburn frantically removed the caribou skins they had been burning so as not to offend those hunters. They were brought to Acacia's lodge to recuperate, but here it emerged that the expedition was essentially bankrupt, for the warring fur companies had united in their absence, and all their credit had vanished. Earlier, Acacia had told Franklin, quote, "I know you write down occurrences in your journals, but probably you only take notice of the bad things we say or do, and are silent as to the good." And now, as Janice Cavell has pointed out, he requested a favorable portrayal in the narrative, in partial fulfillment of Franklin's debts. But this did not allay the stories and rumors that began to swirl around the Athabasca region. Some were spread by George Back to his friend Willard Wenzel, claiming that, quote, "there were circumstances which must not be known." Some circulated through fur trading posts, spread by voyageurs who had survived. Some made their way back to Britain, and a year later prompted John Murray to suggest that Richardson revise his account of Michel's death in the second edition of the narrative. Others made their way to Tasmania, where, years later, Franklin's political foes delighted in a letter from Rupert's Land that, quote, "pronounced the old man many years ago to be a fool. Sir George Back declared that same aged person to be that, and underlined, something more." Others stayed in the country, so that when Franklin, Richardson, and Back returned on their second land expedition in 1825, they were confronted by Charles Terre-Haute, the brother of Michel, who sat calmly on the floor of their tent, demanded to know the circumstances of his brother's death, and asked for his unpaid wages. So we started by looking at the caribou, who provided the boots which Franklin so famously ate at Fort Enterprise. Lying behind those boots were a series of other intimacies and obligations, some of which Franklin and Richardson knew well, others which they may or may not have understood. Intimacy and information had intertwined around the politics of provisions, the costs and obligations that came from suffering and scarcity. And when those obligations were not fulfilled and breaches of trust were revealed, rumors spilled out of those rifts. As the survivors returned to Britain to craft their stories of suffering into a published narrative, they faced new questions of trustworthiness from wives and families who needed to understand a new landscape of obligations and connections. So as the survivors of the Land Arctic expedition made their way back to Fort Churchill in the spring of 1822, letters and rumors traveled ahead of them, carried by snowshoe and birch-bark canoe. For their recipients, these letters were useful social capital, containing valuable accounts of the expedition's progress and a preview of the narrative to come. Richardson's letters to his wife Mary in Edinburgh were vivid and imaginative, describing the screams of a famished raven and making comparisons between their journey and Samuel Hearne's in 1771, inviting Mary to pull down Hearne's narrative for comparison and for correction. But Richardson's final letter, describing their sufferings on the Barren Grounds, did not reach her until after the first newspaper accounts of the expedition's collapse and the deaths. Now, explorers' wives and relatives needed to understand the obligations and relationships that men brought home with them, as well as those they left behind. At the same time, they needed to be able to attest to these men's credibility and trustworthiness, particularly to the stability of their characters and the durability of their domestic attachments. This was linked to what Dorinda Outram has called the paradox of being Perseus, that an explorer's credibility depended upon physical suffering, but also fundamentally threatened, quote, a unitary personality capable of moral discipline, capable of being trusted. Reconciling these tensions was especially important within the circles of scientific sociability, in which both explorers and their families moved, in which reputations were built and dismantled, and in which information, intimacy, and credibility were linked. The world of polite science thrived on accounts of Arctic expeditions which departed from Britain between 1818 and 1829. And I will point out, this is not a depiction of those worlds of polite science. This is a depiction of the worlds of polite science 30 years later, but this is the only good picture I could get. Visiting the Arctic ships became one of the highlights of the season, and young women recorded in their diaries and correspondence how they prowled through sleeping quarters, flirted with captains, and in 1818 watched the Inuk interpreter Jacques Secus paddle his kayak in the Thames. Arctic delicacies like bison tongue, muskox steak, reindeer haunch, and pemmican were doled out at dinner parties. Mary Ann Kay, Franklin's niece, who was briefly engaged to George Back, found the pemmican revolting, but her younger sister later remembered that, quote, we used to treasure up the remnants of pemmican which reached our house on the return of the expedition. These dinner parties and soirees were very much a part of what Gillian Russell has called the conversible world, in which curiosities, including explorers themselves, could be circulated, examined, and talked about. This was a perilous scene, too, and both explorers and their families were keenly aware of being made the object of wit rather than the topic of conversation. And one of my favorite examples of this is Mary Russell Mitford, who mocked Captain John Ross in a letter to one of her friends in 1819, writing, "He a discoverer, forsooth! All he did was go about christening rocks, capes, bays, and mountains after all the great men, dead and living, whom he thought to gain by, and then come home and write a huge quarto about nothing." Now, none of these activities lent themselves to introspection or reflection that Franklin and Richardson craved when they came home. When they returned to Britain, Franklin secured a small house in Soho and begged Richardson to say hello to his wife in Edinburgh and then leave her there and join him so that they could write quietly together. Franklin had lost his journal during the retreat from the Burying Grounds, but he and Richardson apparently needed to be together and write the narrative together, and not least because John Murray was, quote, hot for a publication of our journals. But Richardson refused to leave his wife behind, and so Mary came with him to the tiny 17th-century house in Frith Street. She was a well-read, deeply religious person with a fine sense of humor. Richardson described her as, quote, an admirer of the works of God in the beauties of nature, and Franklin later wrote that her piety and sympathy during that year, quote, endeared her to me as a sister. But we don't know what, if any, role she played in the process of crafting the narrative, although I suspect that the correspondence she had saved from Richardson in the field was brought with them and incorporated into that process. But she was quietly present throughout the intensely cold winter of 1822 to 23 as the men wrote together. She had been married to Richardson for only a year before he left, and he had spent 3 times as long with Franklin. But how she accommodated that relationship within their marriage was never recorded. Now, it is quite the opposite case for John Franklin and his fiancée, the author and poet Eleanor Porden. She already published with Murray, ran her own salon, and thrived in circles of scientific sociability in which, as James Secord and Carl Thompson have shown, women could enjoy both scientific and literary distinction. That is, of course, so long as they positioned themselves strategically, obtained the sponsorship of a male mentor, and constantly, as Mary Orr has put it, quote, dressed their learning in the modesty of potential female error. These circles of scientific sociability were also those in which explorers needed to seek patronage and to be seen as lions, but which both Franklin and Richardson dreaded. Franklin hated the soirees and gatherings to which Eleanor invited him, arguing that they were frivolous and the company flippant. And so, as a result, he and Eleanor often communicated by letter as he withdrew to write the narrative. In that correspondence, Eleanor frequently struggled to understand and to accommodate Franklin's new and old obligations. She wanted to know, above all, how she could be certain that he was still worthy of her trust. She pressed on that point again and again for over nearly a year, in a series of collisions between her world and what she imagined of the barren grounds. One of the most evocative of these moments was on Valentine's Day of 1823. It was the end of an exceptional cold snap in which the Thames had frozen, and Franklin and Richardson had retreated into Frith Street to write the portion of the narrative that dealt with Fort Enterprise. As Franklin later wrote to his aunt, Aunt Flinders, quote, "The recollection of scenes which had been soothed by time and reflection so distressed me that I felt quite unequal to correspondence with any of my friends." Eleanor's response to their withdrawal was to send duplicate poems to Frith Street, in disguised handwriting, one addressed to Franklin, one addressed to Richardson, both dated the 14th of February, Coppermine River, and both signed Miss Greenstockings. It was Eleanor's experimentation, in one hand, with a ventriloquist lament, a form which Coleridge and Wordsworth had also played with. Those two men had been inspired by Hearne's narrative of his journey down the Coppermine, and in particular the account of the massacre of Inuit by Yellowknife hunters at a place called Bloody Falls or Kugluktuk. But Eleanor's poem was quite different. As she addressed her faithless admirer, in her words, in the character of a Yellowknife girl, Eleanor reminded the men of how they had been fed and clothed and their snowshoes mended, and also how they had exploited and abandoned her. The poem has always been seen as part of Eleanor and Franklin's courtship, but I think it may also reasonably be seen as a commentary on expeditionary knowledge and intimacy, both on Franklin's and also on Franklin and Richardson's relationship with each other, and on the attachments that Eleanor assumed they had left behind them. The Greenstockings poem was also an opening salvo in a regular series of confrontations between Eleanor and Franklin over what she saw as his acts of faithlessness, which stemmed from the barren grounds. When she suspected that he would forbid her to publish after their marriage, she threatened to break off their engagement. Suggesting that your prejudices are of recent origin, she asked him what had changed in his thinking about her writing since he left England in 1819, asking which is the counterfeit and which the real man, as she suggested that Richardson was partly responsible for the change. After the narrative was published and the Richardsons returned to Edinburgh, she tried to take her place as Franklin's confidant when his brother died. Franklin responded by sending her copies of the pamphlets that he and Richardson had pored over at Fort Enterprise. And again, Janice Cavell has done a really fine exploration of those pamphlets that were supplied by Lady Lucy Berry. And Franklin told Eleanor that he expected that the sentiments expressed in those pamphlets, especially the idea that suffering was the route to salvation, would, quote, sustain me and you until our eyes are closed on this world, and would be the basis of their marriage. This Eleanor flatly rejected, calling it an aberration of religious zeal that he must have picked up in North America. It was only after they found common ground in grief, and Eleanor compared Franklin's trauma on the barren grounds with the loss of her own parents, that they seemed to have reconciled. She wrote to him, quote, I could not hear you complaining that you no longer had an interest in what surrounded you, in anything you saw or heard, and even the society of your own friends, without recalling a similar period in my own feelings. When one of her friends questioned the wisdom of her marriage, Eleanor responded that she had, quote, the strongest reliance on the worth of his character and his regard for me. I have at least proved that. The latter only derived strength from time, distance, and suffering. At the same time, she commissioned her wedding dress. It was embroidered with flowers illustrated in Journey to the Polar Sea, the Utoka Franklini, Huchora richardsoni, and the phlox hoodie, named after Franklin Richardson and the murdered Robert Hood. The flowers formed an intricate pattern intertwined all over the dress, with the Utoka named after Franklin at the center of each circle. Robed in the flora of the barren grounds, Eleanor ostensibly paid tribute to the dead and to the expedition's contributions to knowledge. But she also seems to have acknowledged that her marriage would always be relative to her husband's other companionships. Now, I began with the image of circles of shearwaters and fish around a seamount, and I suggested to you that they were part of broader webs and networks that traveled in turn, reassembling in different times and places. In the few minutes that we have left, let's think about some of the ways in which that happened, and some of the ripples that we can trace out of the collisions of the first land Arctic expedition. Now, John and Eleanor Franklin's correspondence is a rich record of how one woman attempted to make sense of the domestic ramifications of polar exploration and the relationships it engendered. If it was only one woman, then that would be a great story. But in fact, Eleanor was very far from alone. The wives and families of Arctic explorers like William Edward Parry, George Lyon, and others often operated as intermediaries between the ships and the shore, between the field and home, registering and mapping constant small collisions between their world and that which they imagined elsewhere. In doing so, they also helped to establish explorers' credibility, reassuring their intimate friends that despite their experiences, these men were unchanged in their essentials and could be counted upon. While men were away, relatives discreetly circulated correspondence, which they technically weren't supposed to have at all, and specimens amongst their influential friends. William Edward Parry wrote letters to his parents that were specifically designed so that certain pages could be removed and shared, although he added, "I beg and entreat you that this letter may only be shown to your own circle of friends and by no means published in any shape." The press actively sought explorers' private letters because they were thought to contain the most honest and truthful accounts of the events of the expedition. Whether they did or not was another matter. Explorers generally occupied center stage in their correspondence, such as this letter from Franklin to his nephews during his second expedition, or his nephews and his niece, Marianne Kay. So explorers generally occupied center stage in their correspondence, as the people upon whom they depended faded into the background. But the reminders of those obligations and relationships were never very far away. They were present in the collections that were in people's houses. This is a doll that Franklin gave to his daughter when he returned from his second expedition. There are raccoon skin hearthrugs on people's floors. There are images or drawings that were made by Inimi at Igloolik between 1821 and 23 that are in George Lyon's house. Lucy Lyon would have seen reminders of these every day when she looked at her husband George Lyon's arm, which had been tattooed by women at Igloolik in 1821, and which he once showed to Jane and Fanny Griffin under the table at one of John and Eleanor Franklin's dinner parties. And it was also in the context of discussing the intimacies that William Edward Parry had formed with the woman Eligliac, who had made their maps for them when they couldn't tell the difference between the shore and the sea because both were covered with ice, in which Parry subsequently published in his narrative. If, as Anne Savers has argued, Lucy Lyon wrote the children's book A Peep at the Esquimaux, based on her husband's journals and drawings, then perhaps she, like Eleanor Franklin, was also trying to assemble these frontier intimacies into something different, while asserting her own gendered authority as both an author and a wife. Now, while Eleanor Franklin had pushed back hard on her husband's religious sentiments, others found common ground there. Like Franklin and Richardson, William Edward Parry and the whaler William Scoresby also had profound religious experiences on Arctic voyages and came to see exploration as an opportunity for the reform and improvement both of themselves and of their sailors. Their programs of rational improvement on board ship echoed the work of humanitarians amongst convicts, slaves, indigenous people, and the poor, and it brought explorers together with women like the penal reformer Elizabeth Fry, whom Perry described as, quote, one of the most delightful women I ever met with. And it's notable that in the course of a season, many women went to visit the departing Arctic ships and then immediately went to Newgate Prison to watch Elizabeth Fry having sessions with convict women. Jane Griffin, who would become Jane Franklin, was one of these women. And Perry and Fry compared notes on the reforming effect of isolation on sailors and on convict women. Now, these were important and enduring associations. As I show in the book, not only did humanitarian relationships and obligations follow the Franklins and the Perrys to Australasia in the 1830s and 1840s, but they circled back in turn. There are myriad examples of this, which we can certainly discuss further in the questions. Perry later married into the extended Gurney-Cresswell family, and he worked closely with Thomas Fowell Buxton on the Niger expedition in 1841. John Franklin's evangelicalism underpinned his administration of Van Diemen's Land in the 1830s and the 1840s, as his second wife, Jane Griffin Franklin, engaged in her own programs of improvement and reform. And the ones I focus on in the book are those her programs of improvement and reform targeted Indigenous children who were taken from their families in exile on Flinders Island. Though she saw these children, this is one of the two children that she took, this is Mathina, though she saw these children as failures, as specimens of a doomed race. And that is how she talked about Mathina when she sent this picture back to England to be circulated amongst their, throughout circles of scientific sociability by Count Paul Strzelecki. These children forged their own paths and alliances as intermediaries, like so many others from Baffin Island to Tasmania, who ended up walking in more than one world. The relationships that were born from Arctic circles in the 1820s also shaped the searches for Franklin's missing Arctic expedition, as I discussed in the second half of my book. Following the example of humanitarian women, Jane Franklin claimed during the searches for her husband that she was obliged to enter the public sphere against her will, driven by conjugal devotion and womanly instinct, to equip expeditions and pressure the Admiralty. And in order to do so, she drew on old associations from humanitarian and scientific circles, including Anna Gurney, the secret author of the Select Committee Report on Indigenous Tribes in 1836, whom Zoe Laidlaw has done so much excellent work on, and Sarah Bowditch Lee, the noted ichthyologist, artist, and author. These women and others helped her to influence the press, to circulate petitions, to interpret Indigenous information, and above all, to develop the case that Arctic rescue was a national philanthropic cause. To support it was a sign of civility, and to obstruct it was dereliction of duty. And that is a theme that is picked up in Tasmania when colonists go on to fund a Franklin expedition themselves, and intertwine that with their own politics around the end of penal transportation. Jane Franklin also developed fraught and contradictory relationships with Indigenous intermediaries herself, including the Métis activists William Kennedy and Alexander Kennedy Isbister, both of whom shaped her arguments about the Hudson's Bay Company in and around the discussion of John Ray and his the Netsilingni testimony that he brings back about the end of the Franklin expedition in 1854. William Kennedy and Alexander Kennedy Isbister were also connected to the circles of the first Land Arctic expedition. William Kennedy had been one of the mixed-race children at Cumberland House in 1819-20, and his mother, the swampy Cree woman Agathas, had probably mended Franklin's snowshoes. All of these people were, in their own ways, actively engaged in making expeditionary and imperial knowledge. For each of them, how they shared information, true and untrue, with whom and under what circumstances, were deeply bound up with their relationships and obligations, and their misunderstandings of the relationships and obligations of others. Each inhabited and moved through multiple circles of intimacy, but that process was never smooth. It was always marked by collisions, impacts which very occasionally left their marks on archival collections. Tracing those impacts helps us to follow on Tony Ballantyne's call to assemble a fuller and richer understanding of the colonial information order, quote, by identifying the places of knowledge production, the role of knowledgeable groups, the changing shape of communication networks and technologies, and debates over the status of particular forms of knowledge. We can glimpse these when we allow ourselves to shift our focus, looking not at the seamount beneath the surface of the ocean, but at the swirling life that surrounds it. Thank you.